I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to the third episode of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame podcast mini-series, part of Postcards from a Dying World. I am your host, David Agranoff, author of The Last Night to Kill Nazis, which you can find now coast to coast at Barnes & Nobles. It's my first nationally released book, so please go out and find it. But my next novel comes out in April, and I do want to announce that the book release party is going to be at the Monroe County History Center in Bloomington, Indiana, my hometown, the day before the totality, the solar eclipse that's happening on April 8th. We're doing the book release party on the 7th. So come for the book release party and stay for the solar eclipse is what I say. That's in April, and if you want details on that, you can find out. But we're going to have a special edition of my next science fiction novel, People's Park, that you can buy from that event. You don't have to be there, but we're going to have limited number, and they're going to be numbered and all that. So that's coming up, and so just keep your eye out for details of that. So today, in the third episode of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series, the third story and the last of the 1930s is Helen by Lester Del Rey, which is a classic of robotics. So, of course, I had to bring on a robotics expert, and that would be Professor Robin Murphy, who is... Some of you will probably recognize her voice. She does excellent reviews. I find them mostly on YouTube. The series is called Robotics Through Science Fiction. And, it is one thing to find somebody who knows about robotics, but another one who knows about science fiction and is passionate about it. So, Robin, welcome to Postcards from a Dying World.
Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, you've been on my guest bucket list for a while. And returning, who was last on in our debate about the best science fiction novels of 1968 with Professor Lisa Yezik, who wanted to be here for this episode, but just couldn't quite make it on her schedule. But Brian is, now Brian is a special blogger because he does one called Sci-Fi SFF Remembrance. But one of the things that makes Brian so awesome is if you look at him on the YouTube version of this, you'll know he's a younger guy. And so we get a younger perspective on retro science fiction, and he's one of my favorite reviewers online. Brian, welcome back to Postcards from a Dying World.
Yeah, glad to be here again. Yeah, it's been what, like 6 months since that
6 whole months.
last appearance. It was a long 6 months. So hopefully
Yes.
the next wait won't be as long, but
yeah, well, I intend to call on you for this series many times because, like I said, one of the things that you are a deep reader of old school science fiction, and I think you do it the right way because you always go to the magazine source and find the PDFs online of the original magazines, which is one of the things that usually if I read it in an anthology, I'll eventually go and check out the magazine so I can see what was there with it. And we're going to do that for Helen because I think that's a huge part of the story. But we're going to start off by talking about Lester Del Rey himself. Now, one of the things I have to say about Lester Del Rey is, as a nerd for science fiction history and somebody who has been obviously podcasting about science fiction history and everything, as I have the last 5 years through this podcast and, of course, on the Dickheads podcast, I should have read Lester Del Rey before. But this week was the first time I read a Lester Del Rey novel. I read stories here and there, and I had read Helen before this project. But Lester Del Rey, I mean, obviously the Del Rey name, and I would say um, Judy Del Rey, his fourth wife, is just as important as he was to the Del Rey name. But just for example, if you read, I'm thinking of one of my favorite modern authors, Josh Mallerman. All of his books are published with Del Rey, so and have the name Del Rey on it. And most people might not even realize that they were two human beings who were behind the Del Rey line of books. And that would be Lester Del Rey and his fourth wife, Judy Del Rey. So, but we'll get there in a minute. I want to know, starting with Robin, what's your history with Lester Del Rey? But you know what? Actually, let's go a little further back, Robin, since it's your first time on the show. What's your history with science fiction and robotics? Because I think that's going to be really fascinating for Brian and I and the listeners. Like, how did you get into science fiction? Was that like from childhood, like a lot of us?
It was from childhood. The very first, not that McGuffey, Jane and Spot stuff. I snuck into my dad's stash of these paperback books. I had no idea what they were, but they were forbidden fruit. Thank God they weren't porn or anything, but it turned out it was all of his classic analog, amazing science fiction and science fact. And one of the things I picked up, the very first one, because it looked like it had a little bit larger print and easier to do, and it had the wagon wheel on, space station on it, was Heinlein's Green Hills of Earth anthology. And the very first story is about a space station where they send up a mouthy electrical engineer, female electrical engineering electrician, and gets into it, and the station manager doesn't want women on his ship, and they get into a little bit of tension, but it all resolves happily. And ever since that point, I wanted to be an engineer. I just all about science fiction, was kind of the Heinlein babe, and love science fiction, and have been doing it ever since.
Would you say Heinlein is one of your favorites, or did you develop other favorites as you got older?
There's so many great science fiction authors and different things, but in terms of Heinlein, I'm just back in that competent man stage. I just loved everything about it, and I still think of myself as that Gloria Brooks McKnight character. And I think there's far worse role models that we could have for young people.
Sure. Brian, just to refresh everybody a little bit on how you got into science fiction, because there's not a lot of people your age who are as committed to reading pulp magazines from the 30s and 40s like you are.
Well, no, I mean, I got started back in like middle school, early high school. I was reading Kurt Vonnegut, whose Slaughterhouse-Five I thought was, when I read it, I was like 13 or 14. I thought it was the weirdest novel I'd ever read. It still is one of the weirder ones. But I was also reading like H.G. Wells, The Time Machine and The Island of Dr. Moreau specifically. And I was also reading Michael Crichton, which is kind of a weird one. I don't know how many people would say like Crichton was an early read that got them into science fiction, because he's kind of treated like more of like a thriller author. But that was how I started. And then in high school, I kind of graduated to reading some of like the major authors of kind of the 50s and 60s. I got into Philip K. Dick when I was like a sophomore in high school. I started reading Asimov and Heinlein, although not his juveniles, weirdly enough. I did not read any of the Heinlein juveniles until way later. But, Clark, and it was all novels at the outset, which I think is like goes for a lot of people. But later on, I got into kind of reading short stories and understanding the craft of what goes into a short story as opposed to a novel. So it's kind of like trickled down into me getting curious about the old magazines from like, back in the 40s and 50s. And the first magazine actually that I had read front to back, I think it was like the first issue of Galaxy Science Fiction. read everything on there. I read the fiction, I read the editor's page, I read the letters column, and it made me aware that there's kind of this like other world of old SF that like people nowadays don't really know anything about, because again, if you just read the novels and maybe like the most famous short story collections, you have an idea of like kind of the history of the genre, but without reading like um, the magazines, without reading like the fan forums, you don't really, there's like this whole other side of it that is kind of locked out, right?
Mhm. Well, it's kind of fun because the like the Twitter of the day being the letter columns at the end of the magazines are preserved kind of in amber. So like a lot of times when you, and I forgot to do that this time. I was gonna look at Astounding like a couple issues later to see what people said about Helen Alloy, and I forgot to do that. But uh you know, you can do that. You can see what the reactions to the things, especially on our first episode when we were talking about Martian Odyssey, the Stanley G. Weinbaum story. Like the reaction in the letters pages were just fascinating. And so I agree with you, Brian, that looking at the magazines becomes such an important part of if you're trying to unearth like the impact of these things. And I think Del Rey in particular, what's interesting is because that little logo on the spine of the book at the top, that's, you know, Del Rey, a Valentine publication, was a mark of quality when I was growing up, that it was something that I was going to buy. And, you know, now I know a little bit more about how Del Rey books happened and that Judy Del Rey was a part of it. But when I was a kid, I didn't even know Lester Del Rey as a person. It's just Del Rey was a line I trusted, right? But yeah, and I think what you're saying about the magazines is really key. But and that's one of the things with the series too, is that I think like this gives us a chance to really like dig deep into why these stories like got chosen for the Hall of Fame, because they were voted upon by the writers in the late 60s, early 70s, as these are the ones that were foundational. And this is key. This is the last one of the 30s. So this is the last time we're going to get like a real feel for the 30s. And I personally think 30s is a great era for science fiction. And I think probably the most exciting stuff that was happening was Astounding and Weird Tales. But, you know, this story is a really excellent place to start, partially because um, it doesn't hold up very well, right? But we'll get there. We'll get to those things about it. But let's talk about Lester Del Rey. Have either of you, Robin, have you read any, read seriously Lester Del Rey? I know you were familiar with this story and were very offended when I asked you if you knew the story when I sent you the email, right?
Yeah, it's a classic robotics. I've read lots of his short stories. Uh, I've read one or two of his books, but I don't remember them. They're frankly, those aren't his strong points. I think his short stories are where he excelled.
Yeah. Brian, have you read much? I'm sure you've read a lot of Lester Del Rey, right?
Not a lot. I mean, I've not read any of his novels. I have read his nonfiction book. I think it was called The World of Science Fiction. What was it, 1926 to 1976? It was like this kind of very opinionated, kind of narrow look at the formation of American magazine science fiction from, well, you know, the years that I just said. But obviously, since Del Rey played kind of a big part in that history, um, you know, it's a very kind of biased, kind of boots on the ground uh, look at that little part of
Yeah.
the genre's history.
I didn't know that
And
existed. Now I want to read it.
it's not great, but it is interesting. I mean, it kind of says a lot about Del Rey as like a person, maybe that like he wasn't intending to say, but um, especially because he seemed to be in a very grumpy mood on the days when he was writing it. But you know, that's an older Del Rey. Now we're kind of jumping back to when um
When he was
he
younger.
was just starting out. I mean, this was his second published story. He would have been all of 21 or 22 when he wrote it.
We'll get to those
which is
first two stories in a bit, but let's go a little bit back to where he came from, because I think it's interesting. Now, he comes from a part of the world I know very well, because my mother and father were both from Minnesota, but my mother grew up in a little town called Albert Lee, Minnesota, it's a very small town in southeastern Minnesota near the Iowa border. And most people would never know about Albert Lee, but I spent a lot of time in Albert Lee because my grandparents lived there. And there's one or two counties over is where Lester Del Rey grew up, which means it's a very flat, very desolate, like a lot of cornfields that are fallow during the winter seasons and pushed to the brink during the summer, lots of lakes, but it's a very isolated little corner of Minnesota. And especially when he was growing up in the late 20s and early 30s, he was isolated from a lot of the world. He wasn't in a metropolitan area where he was open to a lot of ideas. And I think that's really fascinating and interesting about him. Now, he told people often, now he was a character, because he told people that his name was Ramon Felipe Alvarez Del Rey, but his name was really Leonard Knapp. Okay. But he also told people that he had all kinds of names, various names, and often with like a Latin flavor. But he grew up in as white a place as you could, Winona County, Minnesota. And believe me, I know I have cousins who live there. I have been there. And even in the 90s, it was not the most metropolitan place to be. Yeah, so he often told people that when he was 12 years old, that he spent a summer traveling with a traveling circus. Who here thinks he really traveled with a traveling circus? Because I'm pretty sure he didn't. But that's what he told people. And he said he hitchhiked west to Washington, where he worked as a water boy for lumberjacks in Idaho. It says that he tried enrolling in university while he was traveling. There is evidence that he did leave home when he was 16 and was traveling and doing things. How much of that was going on? But like a lot of people in this field during this time, he started college and had to drop out because of the Great Depression. It's a similar story to C.L. Moore and a lot of the other writers who were, doing this kind of work. And somewhere along the way, he submitted these stories, and the first being Faithful, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and then the second being Helen Alloy. But as far as, before we get into those stories specifically, I do also want to mention part of one of his important roles, and anyone who has listened to the Dickheads podcast know we talk a lot about the Scott Meredith Literary Agency, because that was not only Philip K. Dick's literary agency, but a lot of the names that you read in the genre worked there. And Lester Del Rey was one of those people who was reading Slush Pile he was reading Slush Pile in the late 40s, early 50s at SMLA. And of course, Damon Knight also worked there, Barry Maltzberg, a lot of these writers worked there. And that's kind of really important, because they developed like this system called the skeleton plot, where they would, if they did it, they had like certain 4 or 5 criteria for a story, for a novel or a longer story, that they had to hit these 4 or 5 things for science fiction. But what's key is that a lot of these authors, they learned the skeleton plot and they used it, right? And I talk a lot about this in Unfinished PKD, because PKD didn't technically use the skeleton plot, but he developed his own formula that's very similar. But it's one of the reasons why that agency liked him and sold his work. And along the way, he was married several times. One of his wives died in a car accident. But his 4th wife was Judy Del Rey, who was a talented editor, English major, She studied James Joyce, and she was a gopher at Galaxy Magazine with the job that Lester Del Rey got her. And then she kind of outstripped him by becoming an editor and starting her own line in 1973 after having worked at Ballantine for many years. And we talk about her often on Dickheads. Like, her role in A Scanner Darkly specifically is very strong. And she was really a big influence on Phil trying to write better women characters and to write better characters in general. One of my favorite things that I saw and I'm representing Cal State Fullerton right now at the archives, is if you look at the manuscript that they have of Scanner Darkly, there's a letter from Judy Del Rey that you can see that's also at the archive, and you can see the handwritten changes that Phil's making based on her letter, and he's like trusting her. And like the very first thing is changing the year, because he had the year like 1974 on Scanner Darkly. And then she's like, I know you do alternate universe things, but let's put it in the future. And you can see that he crossed out the year and put the year that she suggested, like, immediately. So very trusted and respected editor, Judy Del Rey. So, and probably the most famous novel that Lester Del Rey had is Nerves. And I had it on the shelf and just realized that, oh, wait, I haven't read that. And I have time before the podcast. So I went and read Nerves. And Brian, you said you haven't read Nerves. Robin, have you read Nerves?
No, I have read the novella that it's an expansion of, which
Okay.
incidentally is in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, Volume 2.
Yeah.
So Del Rey is one of the few authors to appear in both.
Right. And Nerves is, and Robin, you said you read Nerves?
Yeah, and the original.
Yeah. So the thing about Nerves that's really, the thing that makes it fascinating and interesting is that it's about Chernobyl style nuclear or atomic plant meltdown, but the fact that the original version was written in 1942 and then this expanded version in 1955, but a lot of the ideas were originated 3 years before the atomic bomb was even finished, is pretty impressive. And that's, I think, probably the most, in retrospect, impressive thing of Lester Del Rey's career is this novel. But also because of all the medical stuff that's in there is pretty forward thinking. And what's funny is I didn't know ahead of time that the medical stuff was going to play such a big role in this. So now that we're done with the history, I'll talk less because we'll be doing more about the story. But at the time when Astounding published these first 2 stories by Lester Del Rey, it was being edited by John W. Campbell, which in the last episode of this podcast, we talked a lot about John W. Campbell because we were doing his story Twilight. But between the publication of Twilight and the publication of Helen Alloy, he took over as editor. And of course, his impact as editor at Astounding was enormous. We went into that last time. Not going to go into that. However, it is key that Lester Del Rey, if you think it's important that to note that John Campbell buying Faithful from Lester Del Rey and within the same year publishing Helen Alloy shows that he immediately recognized his talent and his importance and wanted to put him in the stable of writers. And that's key because that's one of the things that he was developing was this stable of writers that he could pull on all the time. And a lot of them he worked with a lot of New York writers that would come by his office. Famously, that's how he came up with Foundation, as he threw the idea at Asimov. And but Lester Del Rey, I do not believe was in New York at the time yet when he sold these stories, but he would eventually relocate and become a part of the publishing industry there in New York. So let me pull up the issue of Astounding for us to look at. This is why I tell people on these episodes, it pays to watch the YouTube version. Not just because you get to see our smiling faces, but because you get to see things like this Listerine ad that ran on the front page of Astounding. I meant to open on the cover, but here's the cover of this issue of Astounding for 20 cents, December 1938. This was the cover with the Merman by L. I always pronounce it wrong. Is Sprague or Sprague?
I think it's Sprague. L. Sprague.
DeCamp, who eventually became very well known for writing Conan novels and continuing the Robert E. Howard line. And then this cover story, which is a great cover of the merman who's obviously in some kind of aquarium, and you got the reporters with the cameras taking pictures of him, is a really neat cover. I don't know how you guys feel, but I always love looking at the covers to see what they were. It's fun to think about the newsstands in 1938, and the people that were coming to this. But what's interesting is that the merman is the only story that's on the cover. None of the other stories, it is funny too, because, that, Campbell would have obviously had chosen this one as like, this is the highlight story. And then it's not the one we're talking about today, right? And I did not read The Merman. I don't know if anyone's read that, but I don't blame you if you did. Let's look at the table of contents. I'll zoom in a little bit. There's some really good stuff in here. This short novel, A Matter of Form, by Horace L. Gold, of course, he would go on to become the editor of Galaxy magazine and one of the foundational editors of mid 20th century science fiction. And Galaxy would go on to become one of the most respected. Of course, we also have a short story by Edmund Hamilton, who would later be married by Ray Bradbury to Lee Brackett, but a foundational writer at this time. And those are the two other big names that I see in this issue. Starting with Brian, is you see anything in this table of contents that I'm missing, maybe that I think is important?
Right. So actually I have a couple things that aren't related, although the first is that if I sound a bit different, it's because I have a cold. So for those who have never heard me before, this is not how I usually sound.
You sound fine, Brian.
and actually, I do have to do something. Like, I hate to do this, but I do have to do something real quick. Like, it'll take me a minute or two. So hold that thought, because I do have a few things to say about this issue here.
Okay, go ahead, and then Robin and I can talk about it. Robin, where did you first experience Helen Alloy? Or, well, actually, first off, is there anything in the table of contents here that you're noticing looking at this? For me, it was the Horace Gold, because I don't think of him as a writer. I think of him as an editor, right?
Yeah, I knew that name from somewhere. Edward Hamilton also has come on my radar recently, because I write a monthly column for Science Robotics, where I explain robotics and try to find out, like, what was the first science fiction story this came from, or did it inspire that, da-da-da. And Hamilton actually shows up quite a bit for someone who's not really famous or well-known the way that Asimov or Clarke or Heinlein or from the Golden Age would be.
Well, and his wife was really more famous than him. Edmund Hamilton, his wife Lee Brackett, was really,
yeah, well, sure.
Right. Yeah.
And
but
so
what kinds of things was he writing about that was, because I am curious of this, because he is a very interesting figure to me. Like, what kind of stuff were you finding with him?
I'd have to go look up what the stories are.
Oh, no, it's okay. Well, and I put you on the spot here. I'm sure you weren't planning on talking about Edmund Hamilton, but Well, yeah, but it is curious that because he isn't like one of the more well-known names, but he definitely was a writer's writer where a lot of people within the community really respected and liked him. And his thing was is that his all of his major works were in the golden age, whereas, for example, his wife Lee Brackett was able to keep publishing into the 60s, and Edmund Hamilton's work didn't really I guess vibrate with like those times as much. And his and I do believe I do think he was a little bit older than Lee Brackett. But I
He was older, and also the work is very dated. I mean, it's the first up, that you're seeing in kind of some hard science. But I want to circle back to this idea about, nerves, about the story
Mhm.
of Helen Alloy. I mean, it's classic for Campbell, what we would expect to see from Campbell's imprint, that he's going to go to people that have the scientist engineer as the hero, that's going to have a strong, hard science, even if it's not believable, but there's some science in there. The
Mhm.
idea that these two guys are talented, but they've ordered a robot and they're going to modify it, which just seems astonishing. You expect anybody just be able to take apart a robot of that sophistication, do it. And that seems very much the sort of thing that I associate after years of reading all of Astounding and then watching it actually go, through my dad's entire stash over several summers, and then going and watch it go become analog, is that type of story turned out to be very classic, right?
Right, totally. And Campbell had like he definitely put his philosophical bent on the stories that he was purchasing and not purchasing. And people definitely knew, like, oh, well, Campbell's not going to buy this one or that one. Brian, did you want to say something about the table of contents? I'm going to zoom in a little bit so we get a better look at.
So the first, what stuck out to me when I was looking at this was that this is one of only maybe a few times that Hamilton appeared in Astounding. Um, because I mean, he was a super prolific pulpster at the time, but he only appeared a couple of times in Astounding because he and Campbell didn't get along. Campbell wanted kind of more refined, by the standards of the time, more refined writing, and Hamilton, who was used to cranking stuff out, found that it was not worth it to like put the extra time into refining stories for this one editor. Um, Also, so I did actually read the Golden the Camp. So
Oh, good.
the weird thing about Helen O'Loy being in this anthology is that it's not even the most popular, or at least it wasn't the most popular story to come out of this issue, and we know that actually because um, so Astounding, or now Analog, has a section down there called the analytical laboratory, right? Which is basically like this little kind of scoreboard each issue has where they rank based on reader input um, the best received stories from like a few issues prior. And if you look a few issues ahead of this one, I think to the February 39 issue, uh, Helen O'Loy comes in second. I mean, really, it comes in third, but the Golden the DeCamp actually tied for first.
Hmm.
So the Del Rey came in second. Um,
Now
and
the gold one
also,
is about a supernova, right? Um,
no, the gold is weird. It's about gangsters. It's also about like animal mutation. It's not a space opera at all. Um, the DeCamp is actually a really fun one. It's basically a comedy. Um, some guy by accident, I forget how exactly, basically grows gills or something like that to the exclusion of being able to like breathe air. So he gets stuck in this aquarium. Hence the pretty good Charles Schneeman cover for this issue, which I really like. Um, so yeah, and then if I remember right, um, Helen O'Loy was not one of the 15 stories that the SFWA had voted for as like the best of all time. So actually, it would have been Robert Silverberg, who edited this anthology, his choice to add it here. And again, we're gonna get to the story eventually, but if I had to pick like a story from this issue specifically to include in an anthology of like great classic SF, I would have gone with the DeCamp. But I'll defend the Del Rey when we get to it. I'm sure that'll be interesting. Also,
Right.
just one last thing. I you didn't read the letters column for this issue, right? I mean,
I
I didn't
did
either, really.
I did not, and I normally do. But this week was really busy for me and I
I
forgot to. And what's because I am really curious what the discourse was. And you always find somebody who would later go on to be like a famous science fiction writer in those columns. The
Yeah, I
last
didn't
issue we
read it,
found a Don Wollheim comment, for
but
example.
I did skim through it because, of course, when you're going through these things, you always look to when you there's kind of a little bit of fun getting jump scared by a famous author's name, and in this case, we actually have letters from Isaac Asimov, who would have been a teenager then, um, and also more surprisingly, Arthur
Hold on,
C.
let me see if
Clarke,
I can. Let's
who
see if we
literally
can
has
find that.
the first letter actually.
Oh, there's an Arthur C. Clarke letter. Wow.
Yeah, his last name is misspelled, but like you're looking at the information, it's clearly him, right? And he would have
Hmm.
been like 20 at the time.
It's interesting. Um, we'll see if I can.
I couldn't
Um,
read, I couldn't read all these because the type that they use for the letters column specifically is so small. I hate it.
yeah, and then I see there's one from Endo Binder's brother, or one of the brothers from the Endo Binder. Like, yeah, interesting. Okay. Well, all right. Well, I'm not gonna get bogged down on that. But there was an Asimov one. That's great. Well, it was around this time. Asimov did this multiple times because we know that's how the relationship with Clifford Samac started over the football story, which we covered in our 1930s sci-fi series on this podcast. So Helen Alloy is on page 118 of this issue. So let's look at the artwork. Oh, she said, then you're Phil, aren't you? Dave told me about you, that you helped to make me. And okay. Now they make the comparison to Faithful, so I think it's really important to talk about because one of the things that is another robot story touched with the heart and sympathy that made the Faithful a robot story that let's see, let me move my screen here. That made the Faithful no more a robot story than the other was the Last War story. So what they're talking about is Faithful. They're assuming that you're a subscriber and that you read Faithful. Faithful was Lester Del Rey's first story, and it appeared in the April issue. And it is a story of, it's very similar to the concept of Samac's City in the sense that it's about dogs surviving the last war of humans and talking about their old masters. I read it a long time ago. I did not reread it for this. Brian and Robin, either of you read The Faithful? Um,
I did.
yeah.
uh, actually, just to no, not today. Yesterday, I read it for the first time,
Okay.
and then today I reread Helen O'Loy, but this time I actually read it as it appeared in this issue. It was my first time reading the PDF.
Of it. Okay. So the thing about Faithful is that I think it does show, from my memory, it shows that he's a very creative writer. And in a lot of ways, I think The Faithful is a little bit better of a story than Helen Alloy for me personally. But the Helen Alloy is kind of to me, a very basic idea. And I do know, like you said, that Silverberg was the one that kind of overrode this one. And I'm not sure that I think it deserves placement here in this Hall of Fame, but we'll get to that eventually. Um, and Robin, what's your history with this story? Being a robotics person, I'm sure how is this story viewed in robotics circles as an early story of the subgenre, basically?
Well, and I think that's one of the things is that I had always remembered the story from when I had read it years before I became a roboticist in graduate school. And the reason is because it was the first of the tropes. There's so few with the robots, and now you're putting it into what we now call gendering robots. And it's one of the first to do that. I mean, we had Metropolis and okay, but is to actually take it apart from this standpoint. And so it's kind of pivotal in the canon because of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I want to go back to something, Robin, with you is that because I realize I should have asked this, but how did you, as a science fiction fan, actually get into? I know you said you always wanted to be an engineer, but how did robotics happen for you? Because I think that's going to be interesting for how you look at this story. How did robotics
Well,
happen for you?
I didn't have a choice is one way to say it. When I went back, I became an engineer, mechanical engineer, worked in industry for several years. Everything I was doing was related to computers. When I'd been in mechanical engineering, everyone said, oh, this new thing, computers, electrical engineering, you should do that. And I was like, whatever. And then I decided, well, maybe I'll go back and get a master's in computer science. And then that'll progress my engineering career and I'll have, more stuff. And to get a fellowship, I had to work with this new professor at Georgia Tech who specialized in artificial intelligence for robotics. And I just knew artificial intelligence was bullshit. And, the idea that you could apply it to these stupid industrial robots and stuff was just impossible. But it was going to pay the bills. And 2 months later, there I am. I fell in love with it, never looked back, changed my entire career path to become a professor and the types of robots we do. So that's
And
how I got into it.
do you have a tendency with students who are engineers but not science fiction readers to, I don't know, do you assign science fiction to your students to talk about these issues so that you can, I'd imagine there's a little bit of a baseline that you have, with the genre, or do you ignore it and try to stay strictly on the straight science of it?
Well, I do both. I have regular textbooks and I have two textbooks that are the Robotics Through Science Fiction textbooks that take things and show one of them, the first volume is sort of a mapping of my MIT Press textbook and a companion volume that says, okay, so this chapter 1, let's go look at this story. Let's go there. And part of the reason why I teach with science fiction is because robotics, we don't have a lot of systems that really work. I mean, until recently, we just haven't had a lot of things going on. And even robots like the Spot robot that everybody loves, finding an actual job and application day to day for it's been kind of lacking. So I don't have any case studies to talk about where the intelligence is. How would you do this? How do you get the user interface? What are the ethical implications? And so I have to turn to science fiction. It's the only way. And there was the time when I was giving an example of why you don't want to do robots in a certain way. The Star Wars universe. The one where it's not I think the Phantom Menace, where Anakin takes out all the robots on the planet by taking out the one ship, the Trade Federation ship. And I'm
Right.
explaining, okay, what's the official name for that? That's centralized control. What was this, and this? What's wrong with that picture? Of course, they all die. And right at that moment, one of the students' parents walked in to sit in on my lecture, and I'm thinking, I'm sure they're so glad that they're paying for their kid to get a lecture on Star Wars. But it was a great example of all the things that were wrong versus what we know scientifically and the use of terminology.
And what are some of the classics that you use to teach? Like what are the ones that come up over and over and over again? I'm very fascinated by this, and this is an aside that I think is on topic.
Oh, sure. Asimov's Runaround is such a great explanation of behavior-based robots and potential fields methodology. We were talking about PDK. Well, second variety, you're getting into the idea of what exactly are you learning? And also there's the ethical implications of that. How are we doing that? How are you doing test and evaluation? So those show up a bit. I did one of the books is based on taking the iRobot stories from Asimov and explaining human robot interaction, walking through each of the stories and what that means. Okay, here's what we would call this phenomena this, and here are the 5 references, people who do this, and here's what our studies are showing. Or yes, boy, Asimov actually got it right. This is how people react in these situations.
Well, and so in the sense of like, also this story came out in 1938. What did the world like? What in the world was the prevailing thoughts on how much had robots been a thing at this point? Because that's one of the things I think is amazing about the story, especially when you look at these stories from the 30s. I'm always like, for example, when I read Catherine Lucille Moore in the 30s, I'm always like freaked out by like how uh how do I put this? How horny those stories are for the 30s. And I'm always surprised, like, I look back at that and go, like, oh, I didn't realize, and then I feel stupid. But I don't know what the world thought about robots in 1938. Like, how much did the world know about that at this time?
We didn't have them. I mean,
Yeah.
they didn't meaningfully exist until the early mid 40s as we started to deal with nuclear production, right? And we started with the telemanipulators, those force reflecting telemanipulators that you saw in THX 1138 and in the Andromeda strain. And then post-war, going to the manufacturing economy. And we started the pick and place robots. And so the first really commercially viable robots were in the 60s, and they were very dumb. So I'm always surprised when anybody from the early 40s, the 30s or 20s gets anything right about robots, because up until that point we had RUR, which is this nice socialist, power to the people, kind of play that's really not about technology. And we have the same thing with Metropolis, and those have been the driving forces in fiction for that.
So what did Del Rey get right? Did he get anything right here?
Not a lot.
Not a lot.
But the big thing I think he got right, that I thought in retrospect when I read it again, was this idea that Helen Alloy is learning by simulation, what we call learning by simulation. You put her in front of the television set, and then she gets all these crazy ideas and stuff, and it changes her in ways that the two guys hadn't thought it would. And I think that's a lot of what we're doing now. Hey, we're going to do machine learning, generative AI. We're just going to scrape the internet. We're not even going to do a great job filtering it and see what we come out with. And sometimes that's Helen Alloy seemed to come out a little better on the results than we've had.
Right. Yeah, she didn't like end up becoming a racist, well, one thing that's interesting too, because if you talk about setting her in front of the TV, that's also a new technology. We know that like when we talk about PKD and Philip K. Dick worked at the store that sold the first TVs in Berkeley in the late 40s and early 50s. So like TV, even like that, is a science fictional concept for Del Rey to explore. Now, Brian, your thoughts on, you said you were going to defend this story a bit, or Del Rey himself. Were you going to defend him or the story?
This story specifically, which is kind of a thankless job because this anthology, as far as like SF anthologies go, is pretty famous, so you can kind of get a good read on how people feel about it. I mean, obviously the consensus is that overall it's great, but Helen O'Loy is one of those stories that when you get to it, people are like, I don't know. I mean, it's very dated, the gender politics of it. And I'm like, well, yeah, but um, comparing it to The Fateful, that first story from a modern perspective has aged better, but that's only by virtue of it not really having any disagreeable elements. Um, that first story, it's clear, at least to me, that Del Rey was trying to write a Don A. Stewart story because it is a lot like Twilight and those other early mood pieces that Campbell was very fond of.
Yeah, and if people don't know, Don A. Stewart was the pen name of John W. Campbell that he wrote Twilight and Who Goes There Under. And so I see what you're saying, because you can see that he was much like Phil Dick said that his novels in the 50s and early 60s were the way they were because he was writing for one person, and that was Don Wollheim. He was writing to get one guy to buy it. And so it's interesting because we look at his whole canon of things, and then you see a book like Man in the High Castle that's totally different. It's because that was one of the first times where he was like, I'm not writing this for Don Wollheim. I don't care. You know? And I think what you're saying is he's writing this obviously he was writing The Faithful to appeal to Campbell, right?
Well, he was, and again, just again, barely out of his teens. He was just trying to make it as a writer. He knew at the time because the whole Donnie Stewart thing was like a poorly kept secret. Like, I think everyone who wrote for Astounding at the time knew that Campbell and Stewart were the same person. So he knew that Campbell liked this certain kind of story. And so he wanted to write a story that Campbell had basically stopped writing at that point, but he liked. So he wrote a piece that doesn't really have character or plot, although it does have a good deal of speculation. And that is basically Twilight. That story doesn't really have characters or a plot to speak of, but it is rich in speculation about the future.
It's loaded with ideas.
It is an idea centric story. Now, Helen O'Loy in the context of this anthology is interesting because unlike the Weinbaum story, A Martian Odyssey, which has a pretty good deal of speculation, the aliens in that story are awesome. If you would ever recommend that Weinbaum to somebody, just tell them that his description of Mars is a cartoon, right? But it's an enjoyable cartoon. And likewise, the characters in that story are, except for, of course, Tweel the alien, all the human characters are cartoons themselves, right? But unlike the previous two stories, Helen O'Loy has kind of a plot, and it has something resembling human characters. The narrator, Phil, and his, for better or worse, you have two guys, Phil, the narrator, who's a med student, actually. He's not like an engineer, and his engineer friend, Dave, sort of actually sound like people without like the pulp inflections of the Weinbaum, where they're just caricatured. And even Helen herself, I mean, well, she's a can of worms, right? But you have to admit that she does actually at points sound like a real person by the standards of late 30s pulp SF writing. And in that sense, I actually think that Helen O'Loy is kind of impressive, because it is not pure pulp. It is old school SF, but it is clearly trying to be something a little more than that. And before we even read the story, you can actually see in that Schneemann interior artwork for it. If you just looked at that art by itself, you wouldn't even think that you were about to read an SF story. Like, where's the ray guns? Where's the spaceship? Helen herself doesn't look like a robot. I mean, it looks like a, old film noir, but that's just how they dressed at the time. It's like, why does every man look like a gangster? That's just how you dressed if you wanted to go out in 1938. Just deal with it. But it's a robotics story that tries to be something a little more dignified. It's about kind of a love triangle. We'll get to that more, but it is about these two guys, their friendship, and how this woman that they create starts forming her own personality and kind of threatens to form a wedge between them. But ultimately, the two men, their platonic love for each other kind of saves them at the end.
Right. Well,
I've read this story a few times over the years. Every time in, the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. This latest reread, I read it in the magazine version. And for some reason, I don't know what happened, but a light kind of flicked in my head. And I actually enjoyed this story considerably more than I had on previous reads.
and what do you attribute that to? Do you, I mean, like what was the light? Just it being a part of the tradition more so from the 30s?
I felt like reading it in the place where it was originally published, I started to like understand what it was. Because context matters always. Yeah, I mean, you can
That's
read a
why we look
story,
at the issue. Yeah. Yeah.
you can read a story in a vacuum, and it may or may not work out. Helen O'Loy, if removed from its context, doesn't work for a lot of people, because it has aged. It is a story basically set in the 30s, except like an alternate 30s where robotics is a thing.
Yeah.
But
Well, and
for
that's,
when,
go ahead.
no, sorry, you go ahead. I was just,
Well, and that's the thing is like I've kind of calibrated as a big PKD guy that he doesn't care what year it was really, and it's still hilarious to me that the only reason why Martian Time Slip didn't get published by Wollheim was because like PKD refused to change the year. Like he insisted that it was 1994 that we'd have kibbutz on Mars. And Wollheim was like, there's no way we'll be on Mars by 1994. And Phil was like, yeah, in this world or in this universe, but not in mine. And then
yeah,
refused to change it. And so I like what you're saying because I'm thinking of this as like, I kept thinking of this. I couldn't divorce this story from the 30s at all. I don't know how you two felt about it, but I just saw it as a period piece from the 30s that they just that's almost more magical than it is like scientific. But
well, it's funny about Dick because he was very fond of setting his stories in like unreasonably close time periods. Like Ubik is set in 1992,
yeah,
and he must have known that none of the stuff that we see in that novel would have been possible, and like the 23-year difference between the novel and like that year. But um, we don't get like a timestamp for this story over here, but it is basically set in the next Sunday AD, as we would say,
yeah. So
like the
Robin,
near future.
yeah, Robin, tell me what you think of Phil and Dave here, and like how you react to them as an engineer. Like, how do these characters come off to you?
Well, this whole like we're talking about, it's a 1930s story with speculative components, but it's part of that genre of, hey, we're smart, we're scientists, either an engineer or medical, and we can just do things. You know, the world's our oyster. It's a very positive, technologically looking forward type of thing. They're good friends, they're practical, they're dating the twins. That doesn't work out. They build the robot to be their housekeeper. It transcends that. Then that changes the dynamics again. So it's pretty cool. And I also think, you know, as Brian was talking about reading them in context, is that when I go back and read fiction, looking at for my science robotics column, you know, kind of looking at the stories that, and then something changed. And for me, this story is thinking about robots in this very positive way, thinking about, you know, what do you do when you have a human female character? What do you do with that? Makes it an interesting story. It may not be the best written, it may not be that, but it was certainly the one of the first to the plate with that.
Well, and she gets her name the same way Han Solo did in the prequel. The
Well,
Helen, she's an alloy. Helen Alloy. You know, of course,
Helen
that's
of Troy, right?
Helen
You're
of
setting up in the
Troy.
first
Or
paragraph.
what is,
yeah.
Helen of Troy, and you know, the ship that lost everybody loves her. So he set it up. I think just coming up the name Helen Alloy is worthy of being in the canon.
Right. Well, and so what I think what he's trying, I look to clarify on that because I think I know what you're saying, but just the idea that they're trying to launch this whole wing of robotics, like robotic wives or whatever. Is that what you think he's trying to say with that? Because
No, I don't think he was trying to think, but if you go back and look back in time, this was one of the first stories up to deal with that.
Yeah.
And so I don't think he was looking, as we've already discussed, he may not have been looking more than a paycheck. But
Yeah.
I think that this is one of the things that accidentally comes out of it.
Yeah, and so these two guys, they you know, so Dave ends up with Helen Alloy at home, and they so what you know, it's funny because there's so many like jaw dropping for our era like moments of sexism in this depiction of this robot. And so that is definitely something that people need to know like about this story, because some people have said that they're using us as cliff notes and actually not reading the stories, which hurts my brain, but okay. So if you have not read the story, I don't know what to tell you, but other than that, it's very sexist. And I know that's one of the things that when Lisa teaches this class at Georgia Tech, you know, she's doing a lot of talking about the gender roles that are here, and this idea that they're trained and taught to this robot by just watching and observing the world is, you know, in retrospect, it did not age well, and it's kind of a gross concept, but it's clearly a product of the time, right?
Yeah.
And we've
well,
seen science fiction do worse. You know?
well, the plot that Helen herself only gets made because the boys, their robot maid at the outset is like janky, and they're like, what if we tried making a robot maid who could think? Now, there's an idea. Actually, one thing you mentioned kind of casually before that I want to elaborate on before I like lose track of it.
Sure.
Early in this story, we're told there are a few little weird things in this story. One is that early on, we're told that Phil and Dave are such good friends that at one point they had dated a pair of twins, which is, I don't know about you, but I feel like you'd have to be like really close with somebody to like do something like that. But in like a pulp SF story of the period, and actually for a while after this would have been published, it would have been pretty common to read a story in Astounding and the characters kind of instead of like something organic, the characters kind of speak at each other and say information for the sake of the reader that they already know about each other. Clunky expositional dialogue. But here we are, it's made clear that these two very much cared for each other because of something that had happened that we're told about. This is good writing, which the story has a couple flaws, but given how young and inexperienced he was, I actually think that this is a very solidly structured story.
Yes, for a person of his age and experience, it is very well written, and it made it into the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. Due in part to the Robert Silverberg. I didn't find why Silverberg. I know there were two stories that he added at one point that were not voted upon, and this was one of them. Why it was so important to Silverberg, I'm not quite sure, but he found this story to be very important. And I would say one of the things that is interesting about the story is that as you progress through it, right, and you get more into like Helen's like she's learning about these things, and I guess when you get to the ending and you get to there's kind of there's a lot of narrative things going on in this story. For a story that's so short, there's actually two twists right at the end, the love triangle, and then Helen choosing to age and choosing to
basically to die with Dave, who of course she is obsessed with, basically from the moment that she's able to make any conscious decision, which is it's basically
right.
It's basically a Pygmalion plot, right? I mean, Dave created her with the capacity to think, and then almost before you can even like look the other way, she is totally fawning over him, and it's like, okay, I understand this is not the most organic love story ever. The love triangle twist, I actually think is handled very well.
Yeah.
Upon like this most recent reread.
Well, and I found myself wishing that, like, for example, like I had the thought that if I was given the job to, let's say, adapt this for Black Mirror or whatever, I'm like, okay, well, if you were to do this and update it, I could kind of see the idea of Helen playing that role. If you were to, and I would, if I were going to adapt it, I would adapt it looking like a 30s, like out of time, weird thing. But I would think it would be better if Helen plays the role like she wants to get older with him, and then and basically tells him that she wants to be buried with him after he dies, and as soon as he's gone, she's like, okay, well, that was great, that was fun, but that she basically did it to convince because that was her programming to convince him, but like learned independence as a robot, that she's going to now have this other life. That's a way I would update it. However, I don't know if people think that takes away the actual power of the story, but as I was reading it again, my thought was that's how I would handle it. But I don't know. Am I murdering this story?
I would say, I think that would really change the story for me, David, because there's the purity of love. So you've got this newly created thing, and truly is in love, right? And it's pure, and we'll see that again in the Bicentennial Man. We want age, we want the whole life thing. We're buying into it big. And so I think changing it where it's like, okay, well, got that off my checklist. Next, would be a very Black Mirror-ish sort of ending, but I don't think it was what Del Rey was trying to get in this story, which is, and certainly with that twist at the end, the idea that Phil has been quietly in love and respected his friend and just could never move on. So,
well, I was thinking that the the ending that you have in mind would totally demolish, I think.
Well, and that's why I know that's why I asked the question, am I demolishing it? And I acknowledge that. Um, because that's the thing is where the ending of the story bothered me a little bit because I kept thinking like, well, why would this robot fall in love with this dude, right? But that I know that's the point of the story, right? You know, so I
Well,
get it.
it's the 30s too, and guys really wanted that perfect woman who's the perfect housekeeper and perfect cook, and they're smart and brainy, and they deserve the perfect woman too. So, I mean, there's a lot of those stories running through
Yeah.
Astounding.
Right. And then of course the idea that, you know, writing a story where the wife just can't live without the husband, and look, there's plenty of in both ways. If you're watching somebody go through grief of losing a partner, you can see that happens. That's a real
It,
feeling, right?
I was gonna say it does happen in real life. I mean, not usually as like starkly as this story, but
Yeah. And I think, where Helen, she has to make the choice because she's not going to die, right? She has to make the choice that if she's going to not be with her love, then, but then it comes the issue of, and like you said, Robin, with the Bicentennial Man, um, we saw a little bit of this too. And of course, in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, we're dealing a lot with the ideas of, are these caring, are these living beings who can develop emotions? And I think that, this would be one of the earliest times where science fiction is considering um, the emotional world of robots, or am I wrong? Like, did we do this before? you know, I don't know,
Yeah,
but
we saw more of the fiction earlier was on the physicality of the robots and the functionality with that. And I think that's a really, really good point. Now, technically, they start off with, oh, we're going to, Lena, our current house robot, doesn't, detect errors or do anything about them because she doesn't have emotions. And we're going to give this new robot emotions. And they've conflated emotions with situation awareness, reasoning, sense making, comprehension, beliefs, goals, desires, intentions, a whole wealth of work in artificial intelligence. But it was pretty cool to see they were going with emotions, but it's the first time we're really seeing this as a major plot point.
right. Well, and I think its role, this story's role, really in the history of science fiction is that emotional core, and it seems like Del Rey with these first two stories was really trying to hit on that early. It's funny because I don't really know of anything else in his oeuvre that like kind of comes across as being like so emotionally rich that's really something he came out of the gate with. It is interesting and it is fascinating. You know, there are definitely science fiction writers who were better at doing the characters and having these rich emotional lives for the characters, but I don't. These first two stories are very strong on that. Now, so am I missing anything on this story that either of you feel is revolutionary? Because one of the reasons why these stories all get chosen for the Science Fiction Hall of Fame is supposed to be because they are ones that you cannot tell the history of science fiction without these stories because they are foundational and transitional. And if you look at, you know, a lot of these stories are ones that are still being taught by uh, people who teach the genre. So am I missing anything about that's revolutionary about these stories? Robin, I go to you first.
Well, as we've already talked about, is you're talking about one of the first up to the gate to talk about gendering robots, and
Yeah.
also talking about emotions, intelligence, ethics, the ability for self-choice. So it really is very, very interesting in terms of intelligent robotics.
Brian.
Oh dear, I have a long-winded response to this. So I was actually looking up a couple reviews of this anthology, contemporary reviews, which by the way, Lester Del Rey himself reviewed this anthology, although he did not say anything about his own story, as you would expect. Um, Algis Budrus, who was an author and critic when he reviewed this, he thought it weird that of the supposed boom of like the tail end of the 30s, because again, you got to think in 1939, you had Robert Heinlein debuting, you had Isaac Asimov, you had Theodore Sturgeon. In 38, you had Del Rey and L. Ron Hubbard. Only one story is chosen to represent that very fruitful, very short period, and it's this one. And I think the reason for that is that, like I said earlier, it reads almost more like the kind of story that Sturgeon would become well known for. Although the Sturgeon story in this anthology is not so character focused, so like emotionally, I don't know if I want to say moving, but it tries, right? Um, it is not a pulp adventure like the Wine Bomb, and it's not pure speculation like the Stewart. It's kind of like I said, it has a bit of plot, it has some character, it has some speculation, but not too much of any of those. So you could say that it's the first kind of rounded out SF story that we see in this anthology. And because it's the first, it kind of reads to us now as like kind of primitive, right? Kind of basic, kind
Sure.
of stuck in the uh, customs of that time. But um, I do think it deserves to be here as kind of an important and actually, for what it is, a pretty well constructed story. Maybe it's not Del Rey's best, but I mean, it was the best that he was capable of at that very early point in his career.
Yeah, and those 2 years, that 38 and 39, were crucially important. But there's a lot of stories of the 30s that are left out of this collection that I actually think are better, and ones we covered on the series that I did here on 1930 science fiction. For example, at the Mountains of Madness by Lovecraft, and Shambleau by C.L. Moore, which I know C.L. Moore made it in this collection with her husband under a pen name, but I think C.L. Moore's contribution to the 30s, to me, the best, and this could be the Indiana Hoosier in me talking, but the best science fiction of the 30s for me that holds up is C.L. Moore. I think she's just fantastic. And so I hear you when you're saying is that there's people who are appearing in this late era, and it's interesting that this story is representing those years. But I feel that way about a lot of the 30s. But of course, this was up to the voters and the ones that they saw as important. But anything else, Brian, on that, or can we talk about the impact of the story? Like,
No, that's it. I like it. It's not like one of my favorites in the anthology, but there are a few others that we'll get to that I don't like as much.
yeah,
I don't think the Heinlein is very good in this anthology actually, but
that's next month.
Yeah.
Well, for me, Robin, like from the beginning, one of the reasons why you were the people I wanted to contact, for this episode is because I think that the impact of robot stories on that, robotics weren't a thing in the 30s. Robotics are a thing, 90 years later. Science fiction is in a feedback loop with technology all the time, but specifically with like, how does this story have a place in the feedback loop with robotics is what I'm wondering.
I don't know. I mean, it's not one where we can point and say, okay, this got the speculative science was right, or the speculative ethical situation was right, or we can look at a particular researcher and they say, I created this because I really loved Hal in 2001: A Space Odyssey, and I said, this is what I'm going to do with my life. So I'm not aware of that impact Helen Alloy had there, but it does show that relatively early, before we had the technology, we were already thinking of things that we're going to see again in Ex Machina. We're going to see this whole thing with the real life robots like Ada and Sophia, where you have female robots gendering. What's the role? We say assistive robots. A lot of times that's going to go back to this housekeeping, cooking, domestic type of chores. So it is already, even, the first thing you're hearing robots, you've heard it from this idea from RUR, and you're hearing it come back, and this is what pops, is already percolating up.
If I had thought about Ex Machina recently, I probably would have rewatched that before talking about this episode, because it's interesting, because it is kind of a mirror image of like, well, here's the modern like take on it, right? And I don't know that Alex Garland ever read Helen Alloy. I assume he probably didn't, but like it is a fascinating mirror to this story.
You could say a Black Mirror, right?
Yes,
It
that
is,
to not make that bad joke, but yes.
Because it is basically a kind of a Black Mirror-ification of Helen Alloy.
Yeah.
But
we're
also,
going to see it again.
Yeah. Go ahead, Robin.
We're going to see it again. We see Mother in the Umbrella Academy, right?
Yeah.
This same type of robot as a housewife, the perfect housewife, perfectly caring, perfectly competent,
Now, I have not watched that show, so that is new to me, but that is interesting.
Okay, well, that was a spoiler alert. You'll discover Mother.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, well, and that's fascinating, because I think, well, what I think is going on with Ex Machina that's different is that it speaks to how writers think about these issues today, as opposed to how Lester Del Rey was thinking of it in the 30s. And what's really interesting for me is, as a serious dickhead, right? Like, the difference between Del Rey is able to idealize this robot and think, well, wouldn't it be amazing if we had this wonderful ideal woman that this engineer could fall in love with? Whereas to Phil, the idea of an artificial person is the most horrendous nightmare you could ever imagine, right? Like, there is nothing in Phil that like could ever even though he had Rachel in that situation and he put Deckard through that. Anytime you see Phil talking about the concept of artificial people, like, it's totally terrifying to him. And it's so interesting because Del Rey is like the complete opposite as far as what he's doing in this story, and I don't know that he's ever gone the other way. But Robin,
I want to flip what you said. It's so amazing that Del Rey's thinking, we've built a robot that an engineer can fall in love with. No, I think the more fun part for a guy in the 30s was a robot that could fall in love with an engineer. That was probably the bigger take home. A beautiful, perfect woman that would love him was more the thing.
And that's appealing to John W. Campbell, who thought of himself as an amateur engineer,
Well, not to sound like philosophical, because this is not that kind. It's not that kind of story. But another way of phrasing that is that, like I said, it's a Pygmalion plot. Ask the question: what if engineers could create something that they love, that loved them back, right? And that I mean, you could swap out engineer for, I don't know, painter, right? Or writer. What if you could create something that had the capacity to kind of, at the very least, reflect the profound affection that you have for it? And
Yeah.
that's actually why I'm not too bothered by the kind of thorny love story at the center of this, because in a certain way, I do think it works. It's not realistic, but I actually think it gets the job done.
All right. Any last thoughts on Helen Alloy? And we'll I think I personally not sure I think this story is on par with some of the others, but I will say that the conversation has melted my heart a little bit on this story, because at least we're able to think about these things, and the most you could ever ask for out of a science fiction story is to make you think and to have these ideas. So starting with Robin, do you have any final thoughts on this story that maybe we haven't gotten to?
No, I just hope that the listeners will read the story and appreciate it.
Yeah. Brian?
Um, I recommend it with the caveat that you should, if you're curious, that you should read more early SF stories about robots as published in the magazines at the time. Um, by the way, if you're on YouTube, you can see that the sun has gone down in the time that we've been doing this.
Yeah.
Um, but
On your side of the
on the
yeah.
East Coast, yeah.
Yes. I know. Well, that's the time traveling that we kind of do with Zoom. Yeah. Well, it's weird. Like when I've done them with Australia, that's one of the mind-boggling ones. But so I agree. Reading them in their original sources is a thing. So a lot of times, what you can do is you can find some of the anthologies that collect robot stories, and there's a lot of them. And Helen Alloy gets reprinted in most of them, and it has been reprinted close to 20, 40 times, and that's an argument for it being in the Hall of Fame. So you can find you can find out where these original sources are, and also if you just flip through on the internet database with these old PDFs of these old magazines, you can find a lot of stories, and it's just fascinating to flip through them. They're look at the hilarious Listerine ads and grow muscles with a pill, like or whatever the ads were at the time. So Robin, while I have you here, tell the folks about your work and some of the different things that they can look for with your columns and your YouTube videos, because and the stuff that are online, because I think there's some really fascinating ones. So just give us a few that you really want to highlight, or you think people who listen to this episode might enjoy.
Well, David, why, thank you. So the Robotics Through Science Fiction.com website should link to the YouTube videos of the podcast, but has longer form reviews of books. Really goes more into the science of whether something is possible or not. And it was kind of built for, if you were interested in learning about a particular topic, you could go to that topic and go. It also includes my science robotics articles. I write a monthly column for the journal Science, their robotics imprint. And I now have my own little column feature within the magazine. So I'm pretty proud of that. And we go through that monthly. Our next one for the month of January that'll be up will be about the latest Murderbot Diaries installment, Systems Collapse.
Oh yeah, because you've got to be keeping up with the modern stuff too. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm curious. My favorite robotics novel the last couple of years was Machine Hood by S.B. Divya. Have you read that one?
Absolutely. And we talk about that. And so a lot of the ideas that she puts in Machine Hood, you've seen running around since the 80s in ethics, but really well done by Kate Darling in The New Breed, where she's a lawyer, went back, points out that all of these, we've been working with animal laws for what, 5,000 years? Hammurabi's gone back and say if your ox scores you, whose fault it is, how much you owe. We currently have laws that say, Rottweilers and dangerous dogs are different than other dogs. You have, as an owner, you have a certain responsibility. And so we need to start thinking of robots, robot intelligence the same way. It's what's the risk, what they're doing, how smart they are. It's not whether they have legs or whether they, what processor they're running. It's more of that sort of thing. And so I really thought Machinehood did a good job of that.
Yeah, and if I think Machine Hood was great, and I like Divya's most recent. She's been on the podcast twice because I love Maru as well. Her much weirder most recent novel, but I think it's one of the best explorations of those issues with the laws and things that are going on with robotics that I've seen in pretty much in modern science fiction. So I'm definitely a fan. So if people, that's how they can find you, and they can find your articles there. I like I said, I don't know if I said this in the recording or not, but it was your review of Mockingbird. When I read it, we read it around the same time that you reviewed it, and so I really appreciated your take on that. And so I would recommend that to people because I also think Mockingbird is a masterpiece and a book that I really appreciate. Brian, tell the folks how they can find you and your work.
So I run my blog, Science Fiction and Fantasy Remembrance, over at sffremembrance.com. I think I had it under a slightly different name the last time I was on here. I changed it. I'm also on the Dead Bird app, formerly known as Twitter. I'm also on Mastodon and Blue Sky. I mostly use those to to keep people aware of my reviews. I also do monthly reviews as part of Young People Read Old SFF, which is an online book club that we could use a couple more members for if you're 30 and under and you're kind of earnest and curious about reading old science fiction. By all means, shoot James Nickel an email, please. And actually, I just got signed on as a book reviewer for Galactic Journey, which is the fanzine that I read the most, although now I'm a writer for it.
From local for me. Yes.
And actually, the day that we're recording this podcast, my first review for them just went up. So you can read that, although it's not going to be the latest by the time this goes up. But you know what I mean. I'm going to be there.
That's awesome. Well, hey, I appreciate, I've always loved your opinion on things, and that's one of the reasons why I had you here. Robin, I need to get you on Dickheads at some point to just like really drill down on Phil. I like one of the things that I believe is that the PKD robot that those people made was his worst nightmare, and all the issues with that to me is very fascinating. And of course, I really hope everybody checks out their work. So the next episode of this series coming in February will be Heinlein, and this is the first time where I haven't planned the guests for that one, so I'm not sure who the guests are going to be. I think Seth Heasley from Hugo's there will be here because Seth, I believe, asked me very pleadingly to put him on the Heinlein panel. So I'm pretty sure he'll be here, but I'm not sure who else from that. And that story is The Roads Must Roll by Robert A. Heinlein. So that's what we'll be covering next. I do, however, have a pretty good idea who's going to be the March with Theodore Sturgeon's Microcosmic God. So, but I will make sure of that before I start telling everybody. But I'm very excited to cover Sturgeon because I haven't talked a lot about Sturgeon on any of the podcasts yet. So, and I know this might hurt Robin's brain, but anyone who's listened to my reviews of Heinlein on Dickheads knows I'm not a Heinlein fan. And yeah,
Fine.
yeah. I'm not anti-Heinlein. However, I just everybody I got a lot of flack for how much I did not like Stranger in a Strange Land when we covered it on Dickheads.
Yeah,
And
but that's a different phase of Heinlein
Well,
with
yeah,
Virginia and everything. We kind of see two Heinleins.
yes, that is true. That is true. Did you want to say? Did either of you want to say anything about Heinlein previewing it before we go?
uh, it's funny because I'm a Heinlein fan, which immediately will make people give me the side eye, but I swear but I
There's nothing
like
wrong with being a Heinleiner. There's
I
nothing.
like most I like most early Heinlein. Honestly, you could throw a dart at like any of his early short stories, and I would probably go, yeah, this is fine. Um, the one in this anthology, however, is one of the few ones where I'm not keen on it, really.
Well, you'll have to tune in and see how my panel and I feel about it next month. Brian, I will have you back. We have talked about certain ones. Robin, you're always welcome. If there, you don't have to talk about robotics with me either, because I have a feeling there are other aspects of science fiction you're a fan of than just the robots. So, um, but eventually we're going to be covering all the books in this one, and of course I'm going to be doing other things. But Robin, I definitely am going to be calling on you for Dickheads, because as soon as I put out a post saying that you were the guest for this episode, one of our serious listeners for Dickheads said, "You're going to have her on Dickheads, right?" And I said, "Yes, eventually that's the plan." So everybody keep your ear out for that. As far as this episode goes, though, folks, thank you. If you made it this far, you're a super nerd. I appreciate that. We will be back. I believe the next episode of this here podcast before the series will actually, I think it will be Cadwell Turnbull talking about We Are the Crisis, which is a great modern science fiction monster novel. So definitely put that on your radar and read that, because I love the first book. Thank you everybody for joining us, and we'll see you again next time on the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series with Heinlein. Thanks for joining us. And